Jeeves and the Unbidden Guest. I'm not absolutely certain of my facts, but I rather fancy it's Shakespeare, or, if not, it's some equally brainy lad who says that it's always just when a chappie's feeling particularly top-hole, and more than usually braced with things in general, that fate sneaks up behind him with a bit of lead piping. There's no doubt the man's right. It's absolutely that way with me. Take, for instance, the fairly rummy matter of Lady Malvern and her son Wilmot. A moment before they turned up, I was just thinking how thoroughly all right everything was. It was one of those topping mornings, and I had just climbed out from under the cold shower, feeling like a 2-year-old. As a matter of fact, I was especially bucked up just then, because the day before I had asserted myself with Jeeves. Absolutely asserted myself, don't you know? You see, the way things had been going on, I was rapidly becoming a dashed serf. The man had jolly well oppressed me. I didn't so much mind when he made me give up one of my new suits, because Jeeves's judgment about suits is sound. But I, as near as a toucher, rebelled when he wouldn't let me wear a pair of cloth-topped boots which I loved like a couple of brothers. And when he tried to tread on me like a worm in the matter of a hat, I jolly well put my foot down and showed him who was who. It's a long story, and I haven't time to tell you now, but the point is that he wanted me to wear the long-acre, as worn by John Drew, when I had set my heart on the country gentleman, as worn by another famous actor chappie. And the end of the matter was that, after a rather painful scene, I bought the country gentleman. So, that's how things stood on this particular morning, and I was feeling kind of manly and independent. Well, I was in the bathroom, wondering what there was going to be for breakfast, while I massaged the good old spine with a rough towel and sang slightly, when there was a tap on the door. I stopped singing and opened the door an inch. "What-ho, without there?" "Lady Malvern wishes to see you, sir," said Jeeves. "Eh?" "Lady Malvern, sir. She is waiting in the sitting-room." "Pull yourself together, Jeeves, my man," I said rather severely, for I bar practical jokes before breakfast. "You know perfectly well there's no one waiting for me in the sitting-room. How could there be when it's barely 10 o'clock yet?" "I gathered from her ladyship, sir, that she had landed from an ocean liner at an early hour this morning." This made the thing a bit more plausible. I remember that when I had arrived in America about a year before, the proceedings had begun at some ghastly hour like 6, and that I had been shot out onto a foreign shore considerably before 8. Who the deuce is Lady Malvern, Jeeves? "Her ladyship did not confide in me, sir." "Is she alone?" "Her ladyship is accompanied by a Lord Pershaw, sir. I fancy that his lordship would be her ladyship's son." "Oh, well, put out rich raiment of sorts, and I'll be dressing." "Our heather mixture lounge is in readiness, sir." "Then lead me to it." While I was dressing, I kept trying to think who on earth Lady Malvern could be. It wasn't till I had climbed through the top of my shirt and was reaching out for the studs that I remembered. "I've placed her, Jeeves. She's a pal of me Aunt Agatha." "Indeed, sir?" "Yes, I met her at lunch one Sunday before I left London. A very vicious specimen. Writes books. She wrote a book on social conditions in India when she came back from the Durbar." "Yes, sir? Pardon me, sir, but not that tie." "Eh?" "Not that tie with the heather mixture lounge, sir." It was a shock to me. I thought I had quelled the fella. It was rather a solemn moment. What I mean is, if I weakened now, all my good work the night before would be thrown away. I braced myself. "What's wrong with this tie? I've seen you give it a nasty look before. Speak out like a man. What's the matter with it?" "Too ornate, sir." "Nonsense. A cheerful pink, nothing more." "Unsuitable, sir." "Jeeves, this is the tie I wear." Very good, sir." Dashed unpleasant. I could see that the man was wounded, but I was firm. I tied the tie, got into the coat and waistcoat, and went into the sitting-room. "Hello, hello, hello," I said. "What? Ah, how do you do, Mr. Wooster? You have never met my son Wilmot, I think. Marty, darling, this is Mr. Wooster. Lady Malvern was a hearty, happy, healthy, overpowering sort of dashed female. Not so very tall, but making up for it by measuring about 6 feet from the O.P. to the prompt side. She fitted into my biggest armchair, as if it had been built round her by someone who knew they were wearing armchairs tight about the hips that season. She had bright, bulging eyes, and a lot of yellow hair, and when she spoke she showed about 57 front teeth. She was one of those women who kind of numb a fellow's faculties. She made me feel as if I were 10 years old and had been brought into the drawing-room in my Sunday clothes to say, "How do you do?" Altogether by no means the sort of thing a chappie would wish to find in his sitting-room before breakfast. Motty, the son, was about 23, tall and thin and meek-looking. He had the same yellow hair as his mother, but he wore it plastered down and parted in the middle. His eyes bulged too, but they weren't bright. They were a dull grey with pink rims. His chin gave up the struggle about halfway down, and he didn't appear to have any eyelashes. A mild, furtive, sheepish sort of blighter, in short. "Awfully glad to see you," I said. "So you've popped over, eh? Making a long stay in America?" "About a month. Your aunt gave me your address and told me to be sure and call on you." I was glad to hear this, as it showed that Aunt Agatha was beginning to come round a bit. There'd been some unpleasantness a year before, when she'd sent me over to New York to disentangle my cousin Gussie from the clutches of a girl on the music-hall stage. Well, I tell you that by the time I had finished my operations, Gussie had not only married the girl, but had gone on the stage himself and was doing quite well. You'll understand that Aunt Agatha was upset to no small extent. I simply hadn't dared go back and face her, and it was a relief to find that time had healed the wound, and all that sort of thing, enough to make her tell her pals to look me up. What I mean is, much as I liked America, I didn't want to have England barred to me for the rest of my natural. And, believe me, England is a jolly sight too small for anyone to live in with Aunt Agatha, if she's really on the warpath. So I braced on hearing these kind words and smiled genially on the assemblage. "Your aunt said that you would do anything that was in your power to be of assistance to us." "Oh, rather. Absolutely. Thank you so much. I want you to put dear Motty up for a little while." I didn't get this for a moment. Put him up? For my clubs? No, no. Darling Motty is essentially a home bird. Aren't you, Motty, darling? Motty, who was sucking the knob of his stick, uncorked himself. "Yes, mother," he said, and corked himself up again. "I should not like him to belong to clubs. I mean, put him up here. Have him to live with you while I'm away." These frightful words trickled out of her like honey. The woman simply didn't seem to understand the ghastly nature of her proposal. I gave Motty the swift east to west. He was sitting with his mouth nuzzling the stick, blinking at the wall. The thought of having this planted on me for an indefinite period appalled me. Absolutely appalled me, don't you know? I was just starting to say that the shot wasn't on the board at any price, and that the first sign Motty gave of trying to nestle into my little home I would yell for the police, when she went on, rolling placidly over me, as it were. There was something about this woman that sapped up Chappie's willpower. "I'm leaving New York by the midday train, as I have to pay a visit to Sing Sing prison. I'm extremely interested in prison conditions in America. After that, I work my way gradually across to the coast, visiting the points of interest on the journey. You see, Mr. Wooster, I am in America principally on business. No doubt you read my book, India and the Indians? My publishers are anxious for me to write a companion volume on the United States. I shall not be able to spend more than a month in the country, as I have to get back for the season, but a month should be ample. I was less than a month in India, and my dear friend Sir Roger Cromome wrote his America from Within after a stay of only 2 weeks. I should love to take dear Motty with me, but the poor boy gets so sick when he travels by train. I shall have to pick him up on my return." From where I sat, I could see Jeeves in the dining-room laying the breakfast table. I wished I could have had a minute with him alone. I felt certain that he would have been able to think of some way of putting a stop to this woman. It will be such a relief to know that Motty is safe with you, Mr. Wooster. I know what the temptations of a great city are. Hitherto dear Motty has been sheltered from them. He's lived quietly with me in the country. I know that you will look after him carefully, Mr. Wooster. He will give very little trouble. She talked about the poor blighter as if he wasn't there. Not that Motty seemed to mind. He had stopped chewing his walking stick and was sitting there with his mouth open. He is a vegetarian and a teetotaler and is devoted to reading. Give him a nice book and he will be quite contented. She got up. Thank you so much, Mr. Wooster. I don't know what I should have done without your help. Come, Motty. We have just time to see a few of the sights before my train goes, but I shall have to rely on you for most of my information about New York, darling. Be sure to keep your eyes open and take notes of your impressions. It'll be such a help. Goodbye, Mr. Wooster. I will send Motty back early in the afternoon. He went out, and I howled for Jeeves. Jeeves! What about it?
Sir?
What's to be done? You heard it all, didn't you? You were in the dining room most of the time. That pill is coming to stay here.
A pill, sir?
The excrescence.
I beg your pardon, sir?
I looked at Jeeves sharply. This sort of thing wasn't like him. It was as if he were deliberately trying to give me the pip. Then I understood. The man was really upset about that tie. He was trying to get his own back. Lord Pershaw will be staying here from tonight, Jeeves, I said coldly.
Very good, sir. Breakfast is ready, sir.
I could have sobbed into the bacon and eggs. That there wasn't any sympathy to be got out of Jeeves was what put the lid on it. For a moment I almost weakened and told him to destroy the hat and tie if he didn't like them. But I pulled myself together again. I was dashed if I was going to let Jeeves treat me like a bally one-man chain gang. But what with brooding on Jeeves and brooding on Motty, I was in a pretty reduced sort of state. The more I examined the situation, the more blighted it became. There was nothing I could do. If I slung Motty out, he would report to his mother, and she would pass it on to Aunt Agatha. I didn't like to think what would happen then. Sooner or later, I should be wanting to go back to England, and I didn't want to get there and find Aunt Agatha waiting on the quay for me with a stuffed eel skin. There was absolutely nothing for it but to put the fella up and make the best of it. About midday, Motty's luggage arrived, and soon afterwards a large parcel of what I took to be nice books. I brightened up a little when I saw it. It was one of those massive parcels, and looked as if it had enough in it to keep the chappie busy for a year. I felt a trifle more cheerful, and I got my country gentleman hat and stuck it on my head and gave the pink tie a twist and reeled out to take a bite of lunch with one or two of the lads at a neighbouring hostelry. And, what with excellent browsing and sluicing and cheery conversation and what-not, the afternoon passed quite happily. By dinner-time, I had almost forgotten blighted Motty's existence. I dined at the club and looked in at a show afterward, and it wasn't till fairly late that I got back to the flat. There were no signs of Motty, and I took it that he'd gone to bed. It seemed rummy to me, though, that the parcel of nice books was still there with the string and paper on it. It looked as if Motty, after seeing Mother off at the station, had decided to call it a day. Jeeves came in with a nightly whisky and soda. I could tell by the chappie's manner that he was still upset. "Lord Pershaw gone to bed, Jeeves?" I asked with reserved hauteur and what-not.
No, sir. His lordship has not yet returned.
Not returned? What do you mean?
His lordship came in shortly after 6:30, and, having dressed, went out again.
At this moment there was a noise outside the front door, a sort of scrabbling noise, as if somebody were trying to paw his way through the woodwork. Then a sort of thud. "Better go and see what that is, Jeeves."
Very good, sir.
He went out and came back again.
"If you would not mind stepping this way, sir, I think we might be able to carry him in."
"Carry him in?"
"His lordship is lying on the mat, sir."
I went to the front door. The man was right. There was Motty huddled up outside on the floor. He was moaning a bit. "He's had some sort of dashed fit," I said. I took another look. Jeeves, someone's been feeding him meat. He's a vegetarian, you know. He must have been digging into a steak or something. Call up a doctor.
I hardly think it will be necessary, sir. If you would take his lordship's legs while I—
Great Scott, Jeeves! You don't think— He can't be.
I am inclined to think so, sir.
And by Jove, he was right. Once on the right track, you couldn't mistake it. Motty was under the surface. It was the deuce of a shock. You can never tell, Jeeves.
Very seldom, sir.
Remove the eye of authority and where are you?
Precisely, sir.
Where's my wandering boy tonight and all that sort of thing, what?
It would seem so, sir.
Well, we'd better bring him in, eh?
Yes, sir.
So we lugged him in, and Jeeves put him to bed, and I lit a cigarette and sat down to think the thing over. I had a kind of foreboding. It seemed to me that I'd let myself in for something pretty rocky. Next morning, after I'd sucked down a thoughtful cup of tea, I went into Motty's room to investigate. I expected to find the fellow a wreck. But there he was, sitting up in bed, quite chirpy, reading gingery stories. "What ho?" I said.
What ho?
Said Motty. "What ho, what ho?"
What ho, what ho, what ho?
After that, it seemed rather difficult to go on with conversation. "How are you feeling this morning?" I asked.
Topping,
replied Motty, blithely and with abandon.
I'd say, you know that fella of yours, Jeeves, is a corker. I had a most frightful headache when I woke up, and he brought me a sort of rummy dark drink, and it put me right again at once. Said it was his own invention. I must see more of that lad. He seems to me distinctly one of the ones.
I couldn't believe that this was the same blighter who had sat and sucked his stick the day before. "You had something that disagreed with you last night, didn't you?" I said, by way of giving him a chance to slide out of it if he wanted to. But he wouldn't have it, at any price.
No, he replied firmly. I didn't do anything of the kind. I drank too much too much, lots and lots too much. And what's more, I'm going to do it again. I'm going to do it every night. If ever you see me sober, old top, he said with a kind of holy exultation, tap me on the shoulder and say, tut, tut, and I'll apologize and remedy the defect.
But I say, what about me?
What about you?
Well, I'm, so to speak, as it were, kind of responsible for you. What I mean to say is, if you go doing this sort of thing, I'm apt to get in the soup somewhat.
I can't help your troubles, said Motty firmly. Listen to me, old thing. This is the first time in my life that I've had a real chance to yield to the temptations of a great city. What's the use of a great city having temptations if fellas don't yield to them? Makes it so bally discouraging for a great city. Besides, Mother told me to keep my eyes open and collect impressions.
I sat on the edge of the bed. I felt dizzy.
I know just how you feel, old dear,
said Motty consolingly.
And if my principles would permit it, I would simmer down for your sake, but duty first. This is the first time I've been let out alone, and I mean to make the most of it. We're only young once. Why interfere with life's morning? Young man, rejoice in thy youth, tra-la, what ho?
Put like that, it did seem reasonable.
All my bally life, dear boy, Motty went on, I've been cooped up in the ancestral home at Much Middlefold in Shropshire. Until you've been cooped up in Much Middlefold, you don't know what cooping is. The only time we get any excitement is when one of the choir boys is caught sucking chocolate during the sermon. When that happens, we talk about it for days. I've got about a month of New York, and I mean to store up a few happy memories for the long winter evenings. This is my only chance to collect a past, and I'm going to do it. Now, tell me, old sport, as man to man, how does one get in touch with that very decent chappie Jeeves, Does one ring a bell or shout a bit? I should like to discuss the subject of a good stiff B&S with him.
I had had a sort of vague idea, don't you know, that if I stuck close to Motty and went about the place with him, I might act as a bit of a damper on the gaiety. What I mean is, I thought that if, when he was being the life and soul of the party, he were to catch my reproving eye, he might ease up a trifle on the revelry. So the next night I took him along to supper with me. It was the last time. I'm a quiet, peaceful sort of chap who has lived all his life in London, and I can't stand the pace these swift sportsmen from the rural districts set. What I mean to say is this. I'm all for rational enjoyment and so forth, but I think a chappie makes himself conspicuous when he throws soft-boiled eggs at the electric fan. A decent mirth and all that sort of thing are all right, but I do bar dancing on tables and having to dash all over the place dodging waiters, managers, and chuckers out just when you want to sit still and digest. Directly I managed to tear myself away that night and get home, I made up my mind that this was jolly well the last time that I went about with Motty. The only time I met him late at night after that was once when I passed the door of a fairly low-down sort of restaurant and had to step aside to dodge him as he sailed through the air en route for the opposite pavement, with a muscular sort of looking chappie peering out after him with a kind of gloomy satisfaction. In a way, I couldn't help sympathizing with the fellow. He had about 4 weeks to have the good time that ought to have been spread over about 10 years, and I didn't wonder at his wanting to be pretty busy. I should have been just the same in his place. Still, there was no denying that it was a bit thick. If it hadn't been the thought of Lady Morven and Aunt Agatha in the background, I should have regarded Motty's rapid work with an indulgent smile. But I couldn't get rid of the feeling that sooner or later I was the lad who was scheduled to get it behind the ear. And what with brooding on this prospect, and sitting up in the old flat waiting for the familiar footstep, and putting it to bed when it got there, and stealing into the sick chamber next morning to contemplate the wreckage, I was beginning to lose weight. Absolutely becoming the good old shadow. I give you my honest word. Starting at sudden noises and what-not. And no sympathy from Jeeves. That was what cut me to the quick. The man was still thoroughly pipped about the hat and tie, and simply wouldn't rally round. One morning I wanted comforting so much that I sank the pride of the Worcesters and appealed to the fellow direct. "Jeeves," I said, "this is getting a bit thick." "Sir?" "Business and cold respectfulness. You know what I mean. This lad seems to have chucked all the principles of a well-spent boyhood. He's got it up his nose." "Yes, sir." "Well, I should get blamed, don't you know? You know what my Aunt Agatha is?" "Yes, sir." "Very well, then." I waited a moment, but he wouldn't unbend. "Jeeves," I said, "haven't you any scheme up your sleeve for coping with this blighter?" "No, sir." And he shimmered off to his lair. Obstinate devil. So dashed absurd, don't you know? It wasn't as if there was anything wrong with that country gentleman hat. It was a remarkably priceless effort, and much admired by the lads. But just because he preferred the Longacre, he left me flat. It was shortly after this that young Motty got the idea of bringing pals back in the small hours to continue the gay revels in the home. This was where I began to crack under the strain. You see, the part of town where I was living wasn't the right place for that sort of thing. I knew lots of chappies down Washington Square way who started the evening at about 2 a.m., artists and writers and what-not, who frolicked considerably till checked by the arrival of the morning milk. That was all right. They like that sort of thing down there. The neighbours can't get to sleep unless there's someone dancing Hawaiian dances over their heads. But on 57th Street, the atmosphere wasn't right. And when Motty turned up at 3 in the morning with a collection of hearty lads who only stopped singing their college song when they started singing The Old Oaken Bucket, there was a marked peevishness among the old settlers in the flats. The management was extremely terse over the telephone at breakfast time, and took a lot of soothing. The next night I came home early, after a lonely dinner at a place which I'd chosen because there didn't seem any chance of meeting Motty there. The sitting room was quite dark, and I was just moving to switch on the light when there was a sort of explosion, and something collared hold of my trouser leg. Living with Motty had reduced me to such an extent that I was simply unable to cope with this thing. I jumped backward with a loud yell of anguish and tumbled out into the hall just as Jeeves came out of his den to see what the matter was. "Did you call, sir?" "Jeeves, there's something in there that grabs you by the leg."
That would be Rollo, sir.
Eh?
I would have warned you of his presence, but I did not hear you come in. His temper is a little uncertain at present, as he has not yet settled down.
Who the deuce is Rollo?
His lordship's bull terrier, sir. His lordship won him in a raffle and tied him to the leg of the table. If you will allow me, sir, I will go in and switch on the light.
There really is nobody like Jeeves. He walked straight into the sitting-room, the biggest feat since Daniel in the lion's den, without a quiver. What's more, his magnetism, or whatever they call it, was such that the dashed animal, instead of pinning him by the leg, calmed down as if he had had a bromide, and rolled over on his back with all his paws in the air. If Jeeves had been his rich uncle, he couldn't have been more chummy. Yet directly he caught sight of me again, he got all worked up and seemed to have only one idea in life, to start chewing me where he had left off.
Rollo is not used to you yet, sir, said Jeeves, regarding the bally quadruped in an admiring sort of way. He is an excellent watchdog.
I don't want a watchdog to keep me out of my rooms.
No, sir.
Well, what am I to do?
No doubt in time the animal will learn to discriminate, sir. He will learn to distinguish your peculiar scent.
What do you mean, my peculiar scent? Correct the impression that I intend to hang about in the hall while life slips by in the hope that one of these days that dashed animal will decide that I smell all right. I thought for a bit. Jeeves?
Sir?
I'm going away tomorrow morning by the first train. I shall go and stop with Mr. Todd in the country.
Do you wish me to accompany you, sir?
No.
Very good, sir.
I don't know when I shall be back. Forward my letters.
Yes, sir.
As a matter of fact, I was back within the week. Rocky Todd, the pal I went to stay with, is a rummy sort of chap who lives all alone in the wilds of Long Island and likes it. But a little of that sort of thing goes a long way with me. Dear old Rocky is one of the best, but after a few days in his cottage in the woods, miles away from anywhere, New York, even with Motty in the premises, began to look pretty good to me. The days down on Long Island have 48 hours in them. You can't get to sleep at night because of the bellowing of the crickets, and you have to walk 2 miles for a drink and 6 for an evening paper. I thanked Rocky for his kind hospitality and caught the only train they have down in those parts. It landed me in New York about dinner time. I went straight to the old flat. Jeeves came out of his lair. I looked round cautiously for Rollo. Where's that dog, Jeeves? Have you got him tied up?
The animal is no longer here, sir. His lordship gave him to the porter who sold him. His lordship took a prejudice against the animal on account of being bitten by him in the calf of the leg.
I don't think I've ever been so bucked by a bit of news. I felt I'd misjudged Rollo. Evidently, when you got to know him better, he had a lot of intelligence in him. Ripping, I said. Is Lord Pershaw in, Jeeves?
No, sir.
Do you expect him back to dinner?
No, sir.
Where is he?
In prison, sir.
Have you ever trodden on a rake and had the handle jump up and hit you? That's how I felt then. Prison?
Yes, sir.
You don't mean in prison?
Yes, sir.
I lowered myself into a chair. Why? I said.
He assaulted a constable, sir.
Lord Pershaw assaulted a constable?
Yes, sir.
I digested this. But, Jeeves, I say, this is frightful.
Sir?
What will Lady Malvern say when she finds out?
I do not fancy that her ladyship will find out, sir.
But she'll come back and want to know where he is.
I rather fancy, sir, that his lordship's bit of time will have run out by then.
But supposing it hasn't?
In that event, sir, it may be judicious to prevaricate a little.
How?
If I might make the suggestion, sir, I should inform her ladyship that his lordship has left for a short visit to Boston.
Why Boston?
A very interesting and respectable centre, sir.
Jeeves, I believe you've hit it.
I fancy so, sir.
Why, this is really the best thing that could have happened. If this hadn't turned up to prevent him, young Motty would have been in a sanatorium by the time Lady Malvern got back.
Exactly, sir.
The more I looked at it in that way, the sounder this prison wheeze seemed to me. There was no doubt in the world that prison was just what the doctor ordered for Motty. It was the only thing that could have pulled him up. I was sorry for the poor blighter, but after all, I reflected, a chappie who had lived all his life with Lady Morven in a small village in the interior of Shropshire wouldn't have much to kick at in prison. Altogether, I began to feel absolutely braced again. Life became what the poet Johnny says, one grand sweet song. Things went on so comfortably and peacefully for a couple of weeks that I give you my word that I'd almost forgotten such a person as Motty existed. The only flaw in the scheme of things was that Jeeves was still pained and distant. It wasn't anything he said or did, mind you, but there was a rummy something about him all the time. Once, when I was tying the pink tie, I caught sight of him in the looking-glass. There was a kind of grieved look in his eye. And then Lady Morven came back, a good bit ahead of schedule. I hadn't been expecting her for days. I'd forgotten how time had been slipping along. She turned up one morning while I was still in bed, sipping tea and thinking of this and that. Jeeves flowed in with the announcement that he'd just loosed her into the sitting-room. I draped a few garments round me and went in. There she was, sitting in the same armchair, looking as massive as ever. The only difference was that she didn't uncover the teeth, as she had done the first time. "Good morning," I said. "So you've got back, what?" "I have got back." There was something sort of bleak about her tone, rather as if she had swallowed an east wind. This I took to be due to the fact that she probably hadn't breakfasted. It's only after a bit of breakfast that I'm able to regard the world with that sunny cheeriness which makes a fellow the universal favourite. I'm never much of a lad till I've engulfed an egg or two and a beaker of coffee. "I suppose you haven't breakfasted?" "I have not yet breakfasted." "Oh, won't you have an egg or something? Or a sausage or something, or something?" "No, thank you." She spoke as if she belonged to an anti-sausage society or League for the Suppression of Eggs. There was a bit of a silence. "I called on you last night," she said, "but you were out." "Awfully sorry. Had a pleasant trip?" "Extremely, thank you." "Seen everything? Niagara Falls, Yellowstone Park, and the jolly old Grand Canyon and what not?" "I saw a great deal." There was another slightly frappé silence. Jeeves floated silently into the dining-room and began to lay the breakfast table. "I hope Wilmot was not in your way, Mr. Wooster." I'd been wondering when she was going to mention Motty. "Rather not. Great pals. Hit it off splendidly." "You were his constant companion, then?" "Absolutely. We were always together. Saw all the sights, don't you know. We'd take in the Museum of Art in the morning and have a bit of lunch at some good vegetarian place, and then toddle along to a sacred concert in the afternoon and home to an early dinner. We usually played dominoes after dinner, and then the early bed and the refreshing sleep. We had a great time. I was awfully sorry when he went away to Boston." "Oh, Wilmot is in Boston?" Yes, I ought to have let you know, but of course we didn't know where you were. You were dodging all over the place like a snipe. I mean, don't you know, dodging all over the place, and we couldn't get at you." "Yes, Motty went off to Boston." "You're sure he went to Boston?" "Oh, absolutely." I called out to Jeeves, who was now messing about in the next room with forks and so forth. "Jeeves, Lord Pershaw didn't change his mind about going to Boston, did he?"
No, sir."
I thought I was right. Yes, Motty went to Boston." "Then how do you account, Mr. Wooster, for the fact that when I went yesterday afternoon to Blackwell's Island Prison to secure material for my book, I saw poor dear Wilmot there, dressed in a striped suit, seated beside a pile of stones with a hammer in his hands?" I tried to think of something to say, but nothing came. A chappie has to be a lot broader about the forehead than I am to handle a joke like this. I strained the old bean till it creaked, but between the collar and the hair parting, nothing stirred. I was dumb, which was lucky, because I wouldn't have had a chance to get any persiflage out of my system. Lady Morven collared the conversation. She'd been bottling it up, and now it came out with a rush. "So this is how you have looked after my poor dear boy, Mr. Wooster. So this is how you have abused my trust. I left him in your charge, thinking that I could rely on you to shield him from evil. He came to you innocent, unversed in the ways of the world, confiding, unused to the temptations of a large city, and you led him astray." I hadn't any remarks to make. All I could think of was the picture of Aunt Agatha drinking all this in and reaching out to sharpen the hatchet against my return. You deliberately— Far away in the misty distance, a soft voice spoke.
If I might explain, your ladyship.
Jeeves had projected himself in from the dining room and materialized on the rug. Lady Morven tried to freeze him with a look, but you can't do that sort of thing to Jeeves. He is look-proof.
I fancy, your ladyship, that you have misunderstood Mr. Worcester, that he may have given you the impression that he was in New York when his lordship was removed. When Mr. Worcester informed your ladyship that his lordship had gone to Boston, he was relying on the version I had given him of his lordship's movements. Mr. Worcester was away, visiting a friend in the country at the time, and knew nothing of the matter till your ladyship informed him.
Lady Morven gave a kind of grunt. It didn't rattle Jeeves.
I feared Mr. Worcester might be disturbed if he knew the truth, as he is so attached to his lordship and has taken such pains to look after him. So I took the liberty of telling him that his lordship had gone away for a visit. It might have been hard for Mr. Worcester to believe that his lordship had gone to prison voluntarily, and from the best motives, but your ladyship, knowing him better, will readily understand.
What?
Lady Morven goggled at him.
Did you say that Lord Pershaw went to prison voluntarily?
If I might explain, your ladyship. I think that your ladyship's parting words made a deep impression on his lordship. I have frequently heard him speak to Mr. Worcester of his desire to do something to follow your ladyship's instructions and collect material for your ladyship's book on America. Mr. Worcester will bear me out when I say that his lordship was frequently extremely depressed at the thought that he was doing so little to help.
Absolutely, by Jove. Quite pipped about it, I said.
And the idea of making a personal examination into the prison system of the country from within occurred to his lordship very suddenly one night. He embraced it eagerly. There was no restraining him.
Lady Morven looked at Jeeves, then at me, then at Jeeves again. I could see her struggling with the thing.
Surely, your ladyship,
said Jeeves,
it is more reasonable to suppose that a gentleman of his lordship's character went to prison of his own volition than that he committed some breach of the law which necessitated his arrest.
Lady Morven blinked. Then she got up. Mr. Worcester, she said, I apologize. I have done you an injustice. I should have known Wilmot better. I should have had more faith in his pure, fine spirit.
Absolutely, I said. Your breakfast is ready, sir, said Jeeves.
I sat down and dallied in a dazed sort of way with the poached egg. Jeeves, I said, you are certainly a lifesaver.
Thank you, sir.
Nothing would have convinced my Aunt Agatha that I hadn't lured that blighter into riotous living.
I fancy you are right, sir.
I chomped my egg for a bit. I was most awfully moved, don't you know, by the way Jeeves had rallied round. Something seemed to tell me that this was an occasion that called for rich rewards. For a moment I hesitated. Then I made up my mind. Jeeves?
Sir?
That pink tie.
Yes, sir.
Burn it.
Thank you, sir.
And Jeeves?
Yes, sir.
Take a taxi and get me that Longacre hat as worn by John Drew.
Thank you very much, sir.
I felt most awfully braced. I felt as if the cloud had rolled away and all was as it used to be. I felt like one of those chappies in the novels who calls off the fight with his wife for the last chapter and decides to forget and forgive. I felt I wanted to do all sorts of other things to show Jeeves that I appreciated him. Jeeves, I said, it isn't enough. Is there anything else you would like?
Yes, sir, if I may make the suggestion. $50.
$50?
It will enable me to pay a debt of honour, sir. I owe it to his lordship.
You owe Lord Pershaw $50?
Yes, sir. I happened to meet him in the street the night his lordship was arrested. I had been thinking a good deal about the most suitable method of inducing him to abandon his mode of living, sir. His lordship was a little over-excited at the time, and I fancy that he mistook me for a friend of his. At any rate, when I took the liberty of wagering him $50 that he would not punch a passing policeman in the eye, he accepted the bet very cordially and won it. I produced my pocketbook and counted out 100. "Take this, Jeeves," I said. "50 isn't enough. Do you know, Jeeves, you absolutely stand alone." "I never to give satisfaction, sir," said Jeeves.
Carry On, Jeeves, by P.G. Wodehouse. Read by Jonathan Cecil. 1. Jeeves takes charge. Now, touching this business of old Jeeves, my man, you know, how do we stand? Lots of people think I'm much too dependent on him. My Aunt Agatha, in fact, has even gone so far as to call him my keeper. Well, what I say is, why not? The man's a genius. From the collar upward, he stands alone. I gave up trying to run my own affairs within a week of his coming to me. That was about 6 years ago, directly after the rather rummy business of Florence Cray, my Uncle Willoughby's book, and Edwin, the Boy Scout. The thing really began when I got back to Easby, my uncle's place in Shropshire. I was spending a week or so there, as I generally did in the summer, and I'd had to break my visit to come back to London to get a new valet. I'd found Meadows, the fellow I'd taken to Easby with me, sneaking my silk socks, a thing no bloke of spirit could stick at any price. It transpiring, moreover, that he had looted a lot of other things here and there about the place, I was reluctantly compelled to hand the misguided blighter the mitten, and go to London to ask the registry office to dig up another specimen for my approval. They sent me Jeeves. I shall always remember the morning he came. It so happened that the night before I had been present at a rather cheery little supper, and I was feeling pretty rocky. On top of this, I was trying to read a book Florence Cray had given me. She had been one of the house party at Easby, and 2 or 3 days before I left, we had got engaged. I was due back at the end of the week, and I knew she would expect me to have finished the book by then. You see, she was particularly keen on boosting me up a bit nearer her own plane of intellect. She was a girl with a wonderful profile, but steeped to the gills in serious purpose. I can't give you a better idea of the way things stood than by telling you that the book she'd given me to read was called Types of Ethical Theory, and that when I opened it at random, I struck a page beginning, "The postulate or common understanding involved in speech is certainly coextensive in the obligation it carries with the social organism of which language is the instrument and the ends of which it is an effort to subserve." All perfectly true, no doubt, but not the sort of thing to spring on a lad with a morning head. I was doing my best to skim through this bright little volume when the bell rang. I crawled off the sofa and opened the door. A kind of darkish, sort of respectful Johnny stood without. "I was sent by the agency, sir," he said. "I was given to understand that you required a valet." I'd have preferred an undertaker, but I told him to stagger in, and he floated noiselessly through the doorway like a healing zephyr. That impressed me from the start. Meadows had had flat feet and used to clump. This fellow didn't seem to have any feet at all. He just streamed in. He had a grave, sympathetic face, as if he, too, knew what it was to sup with the lads. "Excuse me, sir," he said gently. Then he seemed to flicker and wasn't there any longer. I heard him moving about in the kitchen, and presently he came back with a glass on a tray. "If you would drink this, sir," he said, with a kind of bedside manner, rather like the royal doctor shooting the bracer into the sick prince. "It is a little preparation of my own invention. It is the Worcester sauce that gives it its colour. The raw egg makes it nutritious. The red pepper gives it its bite. Gentlemen have told me they have found it extremely invigorating after a late evening." I would have clutched at anything that looked like a lifeline that morning. I swallowed the stuff. For a moment I felt as if somebody had touched off a bomb inside the old bean and was strolling down my throat with a lighted torch. And then everything seemed to get all right. The sun shone in through the window, birds twittered in the treetops, and generally speaking, hope dawned once more. "You're engaged," I said, as soon as I could say anything. I perceived clearly that this cove was one of the world's workers, the sort no home should be without. "Thank you, sir. My name is Jeeves." "You can start in at once?" "Immediately, sir." "Because I'm due down at Easby in Shropshire the day after tomorrow." "Very good, sir." He looked past me at the mantelpiece. "That is an excellent likeness of Lady Florence Cray, sir. It is 2 years since I saw her ladyship. I was at one time in Lord Worplesdon's employment. I tendered my resignation because I could not see eye to eye with his lordship in his desire to dine in dress trousers, a flannel shirt, and a shooting coat." He couldn't tell me anything I didn't know about the old boy's eccentricity. This Lord Worplesdon was Florence's father. He was the old buster who, a few years later, came down to breakfast one morning, lifted the first cover he saw, said, "Eggs, eggs, eggs, damn all eggs," in an overwrought sort of voice, and instantly legged it for France, never to return to the bosom of his family. This, mind you, being a bit of luck for the bosom of the family, for old Worplesdon had the worst temper in the county. I had known the family ever since I was a kid, and from boyhood up this old boy had put the fear of death into me. Time, the great healer, could never remove from my memory the occasion when he found me, then a stripling of 15, smoking one of his special cigars in the stables. He got after me with a hunting crop, just at the moment when I was beginning to realize that what I wanted most on earth was solitude and repose, and chased me more than a mile across difficult country. If there was a flaw, so to speak, in the pure joy of being engaged to Florence, it was the fact that she rather took after her father, and one was never certain when she might erupt. She had a wonderful profile, though. "Lady Florence and I are engaged, Jeeves," I said. "Indeed, sir." "You know, there was a kind of rummy something about his manner. Perfectly all right and all that, but not what you'd call chirpy. It somehow gave me the impression that he wasn't keen on Florence. Well, of course, it wasn't my business. I supposed that while he'd been valeting old Worplesdon, she must have trodden on his toes in some way. Florence was a dear girl, and seen sideways most awfully good-looking. But if she had a fault, it was a tendency to be a bit imperious with the domestic staff. At this point in the proceedings, there was another ring at the front door. Jeeves shimmered out and came back with a telegram. I opened it. It ran, "Return immediately, extremely urgent, catch first train, Florence." "Rum," I said. "Sir?" "Oh, nothing." It shows how little I knew Jeeves in those days that I didn't go a bit deeper into the matter with him. Nowadays, I would never dream of reading a rummy communication without asking him what he thought of it. And this one was devilish odd. What I mean is, Florence knew I was going back to Easby the day after tomorrow anyway, so why the hurry call? Something must have happened, of course, but I couldn't see what on earth it could be. "Jeeves," I said, "we shall be going down to Easby this afternoon. Can you manage it?" "Certainly, sir." "You can get your packing done and all that?" "Without any difficulty, sir. Which suit will you wear for the journey?" "This one." I had on a rather sprightly young check that morning, to which I was a good deal attached. I fancied it, in fact, more than a little. It was perhaps rather sudden till you got used to it, but nevertheless an extremely sound effort, which many lads at the club and elsewhere had admired unrestrainedly. "Very good, sir." Again there was that kind of rummy something in his manner. It was the way he said it, don't you know. He didn't like the suit. I pulled myself together to assert myself. Something seemed to tell me that unless I was jolly careful and nipped this lad in the bud, he would be starting to boss me. He had the aspect of a distinctly resolute blighter. Well, I wasn't going to have any of that sort of thing, by Jove. I'd seen so many cases of fellows who'd become perfect slaves to their valets. I remember poor old Aubrey Fothergill telling me, with absolute tears in his eyes, poor chap, one night at the club, that he'd been compelled to give up a favourite pair of brown shoes simply because Meekin, his man, disapproved of them. You have to keep these fellows in their place, don't you know? You have to work the good old iron hand in the velvet glove wheeze. If you give 'em a what's-its-name, they take a thingamy. Don't you like this suit, Jeeves? I said coldly. "Oh, yes, sir." "Well, what don't you like about it?" "It is a very nice suit, sir." "Well, what's wrong with it? Out with it, dash it." "If I might make the suggestion, sir, a simple brown or blue, with a hint of some quiet twill—" "What absolute rot!" "Very good, sir." "Perfectly blithering, my dear man." "As you say, sir." I felt as if I'd stepped on the place where the last stair ought to have been, but wasn't. I felt defiant, if you know what I mean, and there didn't seem anything to defy. "All right, then," I said. "Yes, sir." And then he went away to collect his kit, while I started in again on types of ethical theory, and took a stab at a chapter headed Idiopsychological Ethics. Most of the way down in the train that afternoon, I was wondering what could be up at the other end. I simply couldn't see what could have happened. Easby wasn't one of those country houses you read about in the society novels, where young girls are lured on to play baccarat and then skinned to the bone of their jewellery and so on. The house party I had left had consisted entirely of law-abiding birds like myself. Besides, my uncle wouldn't have let anything of that kind go on in his house. He was rather a stiff, precise sort of old boy who liked a quiet life. He was just finishing a history of the family or something, which he'd been working on for the last year, and didn't stir much from the library. He was rather a good instance of what they say about its being a good scheme for a fellow to sow his wild oats. I'd been told that in his youth Uncle Willoughby had been a bit of a bounder. You'd never have thought it to look at him now. When I got to the house, Oakshott, the butler, told me that Florence was in her room watching her maid pack. Apparently there was a dance on at a house about 20 miles away that night, and she was motoring over with some of the Easby lot and would be away some nights. Oakshott said that she had told him to tell her the moment I arrived, so I trickled into the smoking room and waited, and presently in she came. A glance showed me that she was perturbed and even peeved. Her eyes had a goggly look, and altogether she appeared considerably pipped. "Darling," I said, and attempted the good old embrace, but she sidestepped like a bantam-weight. "Don't. What's the matter?" "Everything's the matter. Bertie, you remember asking me when you left to make myself pleasant to your uncle?" "Yes." "The idea being, of course, that as at that time I was more or less dependent on Uncle Willoughby, I couldn't very well marry without his approval, and though I knew he wouldn't have any objection to Florence, having known her father since they were at Oxford together, I hadn't wanted to take any chances, so I had told her to make an effort to fascinate the old boy. You told me it would please him particularly if I asked him to read me some of the history of the family. Wasn't he pleased?" "He was delighted. He finished writing the thing yesterday afternoon, and read me nearly all of it last night." "I have never had such a shock in my life. The book is an outrage. It is impossible. It is horrible. But dash it, the family weren't so bad as all that. It is not a history of the family at all. Your uncle has written his reminiscences. He calls them Recollections of a Long Life." I began to understand. As I say, Uncle Willoughby had been somewhat on the Tabasco side as a young man, and it began to look as if he might have turned out something pretty fruity if he had started recollecting his long life. "If half of what he has written is true," said Florence, "your uncle's youth must have been perfectly appalling. The moment we began to read, he plunged straight into a most scandalous story of how he and my father were thrown out of a music hall in 1887. Why? I decline to tell you why. It must have been something pretty bad. It took a lot to make them chuck people out of music halls in 1887. Your uncle specifically states that father had drunk 1.25 quarts of champagne before beginning the evening," she went on. "The book is full of stories like that. There's a dreadful one about Lord Emsworth." "Lord Emsworth? Not the one we know. Not the one at Blandings. A most respectable old Johnny, don't you know. Doesn't do a thing nowadays but dig in the garden with a spud." "The very same. That is what makes the book so unspeakable. It's full of stories about people one knows who are the essence of propriety today, but who seem to have behaved when they were in London in the 80s in a manner that would not have been tolerated in the forecastle of a whaler. Your uncle seems to remember everything disgraceful that happened to anybody when he was in his early 20s. There is a story about Sir Stanley Jervis at Rocherville Gardens, which is ghastly in its perfection of detail. It seems that Sir Stanley... But I can't tell you. Have a dash. No. Oh, well, I shouldn't worry. No publisher will print the book if it's as bad as all that. On the contrary, your uncle told me that all negotiations are settled with Riggs and Ballinger, and he's sending off the manuscript tomorrow for immediate publication. They make a special thing of that sort of book. They publish Lady Carnaby's Memories of 80 Interesting Years. I read 'em. Well, then, when I tell you that Lady Carnaby's memories are simply not to be compared with your uncle's recollections, you will understand my state of mind. And father appears in nearly every story in the book. I'm horrified at the things he did when he was a young man. What's to be done? The manuscript must be intercepted before it reaches Riggs and Ballinger and destroyed. I sat up. This sounded rather sporting. How are you going to do it? I inquired. How can I do it? Didn't I tell you the parcel goes off tomorrow? I'm going to the Murgatroyd's dance tonight and shall not be back till Monday. You must do it. That's why I telegraphed to you. What? She gave me a look. Do you mean to say you refuse to help me, Bertie? No, but I say, it's quite simple. But even if what I mean is, of course, anything I can do, but if you know what I mean. You say you want to marry me, Bertie? Yes, of course, but still. For a moment, she looked exactly like her old father. I will never marry you if those recollections are published. But, Florence, old thing, I mean it. You may look on it as a test, Bertie. If you have the resource and courage to carry this thing through, I will take it as evidence that you are not the vapid and shiftless person most people think you. If you fail, I shall know that your Aunt Agatha was right when she called you a spineless invertebrate and advised me strongly not to marry you. It will be perfectly simple for you to intercept the manuscript, Bertie. It only requires a little resolution. But suppose Uncle Willoughby catches me at it. He'd cut me off with a bob. If you care more for your uncle's money than for me... No, rather not. Very well, then. The parcel containing the manuscript will, of course, be placed on the hall table tomorrow for Oakshott to take to the village with the letters. All you have to do is to take it away and destroy it. Then your uncle will think it's been lost in the post. It sounded thin to me. Hasn't he got a copy of it? No, it has not been typed. He's sending the manuscript just as he wrote it. But he could write it over again, as if he would have the energy. But if you're going to do nothing but make absurd objections, Bertie, I was only pointing things out. Well, don't. Once and for all, will you do me this quite simple act of kindness? The way she put it gave me an idea. Why not get Edwin to do it? Keep it in the family, kind of, don't you know? Besides, it would be a boon to the kid. A jolly bright idea, it seemed to me. Edwin was her young brother, who was spending his holidays at Easby. He was a ferret-faced kid whom I had disliked since birth. As a matter of fact, talking of recollections and memories, it was young blighted Edwin who 9 years before had led his father to where I was smoking his cigar and caused all the unpleasantness. He was 14 now and had just joined the Boy Scouts. He was one of those thorough kids and took his responsibilities pretty seriously. He was always in a sort of fever because he was dropping behind schedule with his daily acts of kindness. However hard he tried, he'd fall behind, and then he would find him prowling about the house, setting such a clip to try and catch up with himself that Easby was rapidly becoming a perfect hell for man and beast. The idea didn't seem to strike Florence. I shall do nothing of the kind, Bertie. I wonder you can't appreciate the compliment I'm paying you, trusting you like this. Oh, I see that all right, but what I mean is, Edwin would do it much better than I would. These Boy Scouts are up to all sorts of dodges. They spoor, don't you know, and take cover and creep about and what not. Bertie, will you or will you not do this perfectly trivial thing for me? If not, say so now, and let us end this farce of pretending that you care a snap of the fingers for me. Dear old soul, I love you devotedly. Then will you or will you not? Oh, all right, I said. All right, all right, all right. And then I tottered forth to think it over. I met Jeeves in the passage just outside. I beg your pardon, sir. I was endeavouring to find you. What's the matter? I felt that I should tell you, sir, that somebody has been putting black polish on our brown walking shoes. What? Who? Why? I could not say, sir. Can anything be done with them? Nothing, sir. Damn. Very good, sir. I've often wondered since then how these murderer fellows manage to keep in shape while they're contemplating their next effort. I had a much simpler sort of job on hand, and the thought of it rattled me to such an extent in the night watches that I was a perfect wreck next day. Dark circles under the eyes, I give you my word. I had to call on Jeeves to rally round with one of those lifesavers of his. From breakfast on, I felt like a bag snatcher at a railway station. I had to hang about waiting for the parcel to be put on the hall table, and it wasn't put. Uncle Willoughby was a fixture in the library, adding the finishing touches to the great work, I supposed, and the more I thought the thing over, the less I liked it. The chances against my pulling it off seemed about 3-2, and the thought of what would happen if I didn't gave me cold shivers down the spine. Uncle Willoughby was a pretty mild sort of old boy as a rule, but I'd known him to cut up rough, and by Jove, he was scheduled to extend himself if he caught me trying to get away with his life work. It wasn't till nearly 4 that he toddled out of the library with the parcel under his arm, put it on the table, and toddled off again. I was hiding a bit to the southeast at the moment, behind a suit of armour. I bounded out and legged it for the table. Then I nipped upstairs to hide the swag. I charged in like a mustang, and nearly stubbed my toe on young blighted Edwin, the Boy Scout. He was standing at the chest of drawers, confound him, messing about with my ties. "Hello," he said. "What are you doing here?" "I'm tidying your room. It's my last Saturday's act of kindness." "Last Saturday's?" "I'm 5 days behind. I was 6 till last night, but I polished your shoes." "Was it you?" "Yes. Did you see them?" "I just happened to think of it. I was in here looking round. Mr. Barclay had this room while you were away. He left this morning. I thought perhaps he might have left something in it that I could have sent on. I've often done acts of kindness that way." "You must be a comfort to one and all." It became more and more apparent to me that this infernal kid must somehow be turned out eftsoons or right speedily. I had hidden the parcel behind my back, and I didn't think he'd seen it, but I wanted to get at that chest of drawers quick before anyone else came along. I shouldn't bother about tidying the room," I said. "I like tidying it. It's not a bit of trouble, really." "But it's quite tidy now." "Not so tidy as I shall make it." This was getting perfectly rotten. I didn't want to murder the kid, and yet there didn't seem to be any other way of shifting him. I pressed down the mental accelerator. The old lemon throbbed fiercely. I got an idea. "There's something much kinder than that which you could do," I said. "You see that box of cigars? Take it down to the smoking room and snip off the ends for me. That would save me no end of trouble. Stagger along, laddie." He seemed a bit doubtful, but he staggered. I shoved the parcel into a drawer, locked it, trousered the key, and felt better. I might be a chump, but dash it, I could out-general a mere kid with a face like a ferret. I went downstairs again. Just as I was passing the smoking-room door, out curveted Edwin. It seemed to me that if he wanted to do a real act of kindness, he would commit suicide. "I'm snipping them," he said. "Snip on, snip on." "Do you like them snipped much, or only a bit?" "Medium." "All right, I'll be getting on then." I should. And we parted. Fellows who know all about that sort of thing, detectives and so on, will tell you that the most difficult thing in the world is to get rid of the body. I remember, as a kid, having to learn by heart a poem about a bird by the name of Eugene Aram, who had the deuce of a job in this respect. All I can recall of the actual poetry is the bit that goes, "Tum-tum, tum-tum, tum-tum-ti-tum, I slew him, tum-ta-tum." But I recollect that the poor blighter spent much of his valuable time dumping the corpse into ponds and burying it and what not, only to have it pop out at him again. It was about an hour after I had shoved the parcel into the drawer when I realized that I had let myself in for just the same sort of thing. Florence had talked in an airy sort of way about destroying the manuscript, but when one came down to it, how the deuce can a chap destroy a great chunky mass of paper in somebody else's house in the middle of summer? I couldn't ask to have a fire in my bedroom with a thermometer in the 80s, and if I didn't burn the thing, how else could I get rid of it? Fellows on the battlefield eat dispatches to keep them from falling into the hands of the enemy, but it would have taken me a year to eat Uncle Willoughby's recollections. I'm bound to say the problem absolutely baffled me. The only thing seemed to be to leave the parcel in the drawer and hope for the best. I don't know whether you've ever experienced it, but it's a dashed unpleasant thing having a crime on one's conscience. Towards the end of the day, the mere sight of the drawer began to depress me. I found myself getting all on edge, and once, when Uncle Willoughby trickled silently into the smoking room when I was alone there, and spoke to me before I knew he was there, I broke the record for the sitting high jump. I was wondering all the time when Uncle Willoughby would sit up and take notice. I didn't think he would have time to suspect that anything had gone wrong till Saturday morning, when he would be expecting, of course, to get the acknowledgement of the manuscript from the publishers. But early on Friday evening, he came out of the library as I was passing and asked me to step in. He was looking considerably rattled. "Bertie," he said, he always spoke in a precise, sort of pompous kind of way, "an exceedingly disturbing thing has happened. As you know, I dispatched the manuscript of my book to Messrs. Riggs and Ballinger, the publishers, yesterday afternoon. It should have reached them by the first post this morning. Why I should have been uneasy, I cannot say, but my mind was not altogether at rest respecting the safety of the parcel. I therefore telephoned to Messrs. Riggs and Ballinger a few moments back to make inquiries. To my consternation, they informed me they were not yet in receipt of my manuscript. Very rum. I recollect distinctly placing it myself on the hall table in good time to be taken to the village. But here is a sinister thing. I have spoken to Oakshott, who took the rest of the letters to the post office, and he cannot recall seeing it there. He is indeed unswerving in his assertions that when he went to the hall to collect the letters, there was no parcel among them. Sounds funny. Bertie, shall I tell you what I suspect? What's that? The suspicion will no doubt sound to you incredible, but it alone seems to fit the facts as we know them. I incline to the belief that the parcel has been stolen. Oh, I say, surely not. Wait, hear me out. Though I have said nothing to you before, or to anyone else, concerning the matter, the fact remains that during the past few weeks a number of objects, some valuable, others not, have disappeared in this house. The conclusion to which one is irresistibly impelled is that we have a kleptomaniac in our midst. It is a peculiarity of kleptomania, as you are no doubt aware, that the subject is unable to differentiate between the intrinsic values of objects. He will purloin an old coat as readily as a diamond ring, or a tobacco pipe costing but a few shillings with the same eagerness as a purse of gold. The fact that this manuscript of mine could be of no possible value to any outside person convinces me that— But, Uncle, one moment. I know all about those things that were stolen. It was Meadows, my man, who pinched them. I caught him snaffling my silk socks, right in the act, by Jove. He was tremendously impressed. You amaze me, Bertie. Send for the man at once and question him. But he isn't here. You see, directly I found that he was a sock sneaker, I gave him the boot. That's why I went to London, to get a new man. But then, if the man Meadows is no longer in the house, it could not be he who purloined my manuscript. The whole thing is inexplicable. After which we brooded for a bit. Uncle Willoughby pottered about the room, registering baffledness, while I sat sucking at a cigarette, feeling rather like a chappie I'd once read about in a book, who murdered another cove and hid the body under the dining-room table, and then had to be the life and soul of a dinner party with it there all the time. My guilty secret oppressed me to such an extent that after a while I couldn't stick it any longer. I lit another cigarette and started for a stroll in the grounds, by way of cooling off. It was one of those still evenings you get in the summer, when you can hear a snail clear its throat a mile away. The sun was sinking over the hills, and the gnats were fooling about all over the place, and everything smelled rather topping, what with the falling dew and so on, and I was just beginning to feel a little soothed by the peace of it all, when suddenly I heard my name spoken. "It's about Bertie." It was the loathsome voice of young blighted Edwin. For a moment I couldn't locate it. Then I realized that it came from the library. My stroll had taken me within a few yards of the open window. I had often wondered how those Johnnies in books did it. I mean, the fellows with whom it was a work of a moment to do about a dozen things which ought to have taken them about 10 minutes. But as a matter of fact, it was the work of a moment with me to chuck away my cigarette, swear a bit, leap about 10 yards, dive into a bush that stood near the library window, and stand there with my ears flapping. I was as certain as I've ever been of anything that all sorts of rotten things were in the offing. "About Bertie," I heard Uncle Willoughby say. "About Bertie and your parcel. I heard you talking to him just now. I believe he's got it." When I tell you that just as I heard these frightful words, a fairly substantial beetle of sorts dropped from the bush down the back of my neck, and I couldn't even stir to squash the same, you will understand that I felt pretty rotten. Everything seemed against me. "What do you mean, boy?" "I was discussing the disappearance of my manuscript with Bertie only a moment back, and he professed himself as perplexed by the mystery as myself. Well, I was in his room yesterday afternoon, doing him an act of kindness, and he came in with a parcel. I could see it, though he tried to keep it behind his back. And then he asked me to go to the smoking room and snip some cigars for him, and about 2 minutes afterwards he came down, and he wasn't carrying anything, so it must be in his room." I understand they deliberately teach these dash boy scouts to cultivate their powers of observation and deduction and what not. Devilish thoughtless and inconsiderate of them, I call it. Look at the trouble it causes. "It sounds incredible," said Uncle Willoughby, thereby bucking me up a trifle. "Shall I go and look in his room?" asked young blighted Edwin. "I'm sure the parcel's there." But what could be his motive for perpetrating this extraordinary theft? "Perhaps he's what you said just now." "A kleptomaniac? Impossible." "It might have been Bertie who took all those things from the very start," suggested the little brute hopefully. "He may be like Raffles." "Raffles?" "He's a chap in a book who went about pinching things." "I cannot believe that Bertie would, go about pinching things." "Well, I'm sure he's got the parcel. I'll tell you what you might do. You might say that Mr. Barclay wired that he had left something there. He had Bertie's room, you know. You might say you wanted to look for it." "That would be possible. I didn't wait to hear any more. Things were getting too hot. I sneaked softly out of my bush and raced for the front door. I sprinted up to my room and made for the drawer where I had put the parcel. And then I found I hadn't the key. It wasn't for the deuce of a time that I recollected I had shifted it to my evening trousers the night before and must have forgotten to take it out again. Where the dickens were my evening things? I looked all over the place before I remembered that Jeeves must have taken them away to brush. To leap at the bell and ring it was, with me, the work of a moment. I had just rung it when there was a footstep outside, and in came Uncle Willoughby. "Oh, Bertie," he said, without a blush, "I have, received a telegram from Barclay, who occupied this room in your absence, asking me to forward him his cigarette case, which, it would appear, he inadvertently omitted to take with him when he left the house. I cannot find it downstairs, and it has therefore occurred to me that he may have left it in this room. I will, just take a look round." It was one of the most disgusting spectacles I've ever seen. This white-haired old man, who should have been thinking of the hereafter, standing there lying like an actor. "I haven't seen it anywhere," I said. "Nevertheless, I will search. I must, spare no effort." "I should have seen it if it had been here. What?" "It may have escaped your notice. It is, possibly in one of the drawers." He began to nose about. He pulled out drawer after drawer, pottering round like an old bloodhound, and babbling from time to time about Barclay and his cigarette case in a way that struck me as perfectly ghastly. I just stood there, losing weight every moment. Then he came to the drawer where the parcel was. "This appears to be locked," he said, rattling the handle. "Yes, I shouldn't bother about that one. It's locked and all that sort of thing." "You have not the key?" A soft, respectful voice spoke behind me. "I fancy, sir, that this must be the key you require. It was in the pocket of your evening trousers." It was Jeeves. He had shimmered in, carrying my evening things, and was standing there holding out the key. I could have massacred the man. "Thank you," said my uncle. "Not at all, sir." The next moment Uncle Willoughby had opened the drawer. I shut my eyes. "No," said Uncle Willoughby, "there is nothing here. The drawer is empty. Thank you, Bertie. I hope I have not disturbed you. I fancy, Barclay must have taken his case with him after all." When he had gone, I shut the door carefully. Then I turned to Jeeves. The man was putting my evening things out on a chair. Jeeves?" "Sir?" "Oh, nothing." It was deuced difficult to know how to begin. Jeeves?" "Sir?" "Did you, have you by any chance—" "I removed the parcel this morning, sir." "Oh, why?" "I considered it more prudent, sir." I mused for a while. "Of course, I suppose all this seems tolerably rummy to you, Jeeves." "But not at all, sir. I chanced to overhear you and Lady Florence speaking of the matter the other evening, sir." "Did you, by Jove?" "Yes, sir." "Well, Jeeves, I think that on the whole, if you were to, as it were, freeze on to that parcel till we get back to London—" "Exactly, sir." "And then we might, so to speak, chuck it away somewhere. What?" "Precisely, sir." "I leave it in your hands." "Entirely, sir." "You know, Jeeves, you're by way of being rather a topper." "I endeavour to give satisfaction, sir." "1 in a million, by Jove." "It is very kind of you to say so, sir." "Well, that's about all then, I think." "Very good, sir." Florence came back on Monday. I didn't see her till we were all having tea in the hall. It wasn't till the crowd had cleared away a bit that we got a chance of having a word together. "Well, Bertie," she said, "it's all right. You've destroyed the manuscript. Not exactly, but what do you mean?" I mean, I haven't absolutely—" "Bertie, your manner is furtive." "It's all right. It's this way." And I was just going to explain how things stood when out of the library came leaping Uncle Willoughby, looking as braced as a 2-year-old. The old boy was a changed man. "The most remarkable thing, Bertie. I have just been speaking with Mr. Riggs on the telephone, and he tells me he received my manuscript by the first post this morning. I cannot imagine what can have caused the delay. Our postal facilities are extremely inadequate in the rural districts. I shall write to headquarters about it. It is insufferable if valuable parcels are to be delayed in this fashion." I happened to be looking at Florence's profile at the moment, and at this juncture she swung round and gave me a look that went right through me like a knife. Uncle Willoughby meandered back to the library, and there was a silence that you could have dug bits out of with a spoon. "I can't understand it," I said at last. "I can't understand it, by Jove." I can understand it perfectly, Bertie. Your heart failed you. Rather than risk offending your uncle, you—" No, absolutely. You preferred to lose me rather than risk losing the money. Perhaps you did not think I meant what I said. I meant every word. Our engagement is ended. But, I say, not another word. But, Florence, old thing, I do not wish to hear any more. I see now that your Aunt Agatha was perfectly right. I consider that I've had a very lucky escape. There was a time when I thought that with patience you might be moulded into something worthwhile. I see now that you are impossible." And she popped off, leaving me to pick up the pieces. When I had collected the debris to some extent, I went to my room and rang for Jeeves. He came in, looking as if nothing had happened or was ever going to happen. He was the calmest thing in captivity. "Jeeves!" I yelled. "Jeeves, that parcel has arrived in London." "Yes, sir." "Did you send it?" "Yes, sir. I acted for the best, sir. I think that both you and Lady Florence overestimated the danger of people being offended at being mentioned in Sir Willoughby's recollections. It has been my experience, sir, that the normal person enjoys seeing his or her name in print, irrespective of what is said about them. I have an aunt, sir, who a few years ago was a martyr to swollen limbs. She tried Walkinshaw's Supreme Ointment and obtained considerable relief, so much so that she sent them an unsolicited testimonial. Her pride at seeing her photograph in the daily papers in connection with descriptions of her lower limbs before taking, which were nothing less than revolting, was so intense that it led me to believe that publicity of whatever sort is what nearly everybody desires. Moreover, if you have ever studied psychology, sir, you will know that respectable old gentlemen are by no means averse to having it advertised that they were extremely wild in their youth. I have an uncle—" I cursed his aunts and his uncles and him and all the rest of the family. Do you know that Lady Florence has broken off her engagement with me? Indeed, sir? Not a bit of sympathy. I might have been telling him it was a fine day. You're sacked. Very good, sir. He coughed gently. As I am no longer in your employment, sir, I can speak freely without appearing to take a liberty. In my opinion, you and Lady Florence were quite unsuitably matched. Her ladyship is of a highly determined and arbitrary temperament, quite opposed to your own. I was in Lord Worplesdon's service for nearly a year, during which time I had ample opportunities of studying her ladyship. The opinion of the servants' hall was far from favourable to her. Her ladyship's temper caused a good deal of adverse comment among us. It was at times quite impossible. You would not have been happy, sir. Get out! I think you would also have found her educational methods a little trying, sir. I have glanced at the book her ladyship gave you. It has been lying on your table since our arrival, and it is, in my opinion, quite unsuitable. You would not have enjoyed it. And I have it from her ladyship's own maid, who happened to overhear a conversation between her ladyship and one of the gentlemen staying here, Mr. Maxwell, who is employed in an editorial capacity by one of the reviews, that it was her intention to start you almost immediately upon Nietzsche. You would not enjoy Nietzsche, sir. He is fundamentally unsound. Get out! Very good, sir. It's rummy how sleeping on a thing often makes you feel quite different about it. It's happened to me over and over again. Somehow or other, when I woke next morning, the old heart didn't feel half so broken as it had done. It was a perfectly topping day, and there was something about the way the sun came in at the window and the row the birds were kicking up in the ivy that made me half wonder whether Jeeves wasn't right. After all, though she had a wonderful profile, was it such a catch being engaged to Florence Cray as the casual observer might imagine? Wasn't there something in what Jeeves had said about her character? I began to realize that my ideal wife was something quite different, something a lot more clinging and drooping and prattling and what not. I had got as far as this in thinking the thing out when that Types of Ethical Theory caught my eye. I opened it, and I give you my honest word, this was what hit me. Of the two antithetic terms in the Greek philosophy, one only was real and self-subsisting, and that one was ideal thought as opposed to that which it has to penetrate and mould. The other, corresponding to our own nature, was in itself phenomenal, unreal without any permanent footing, having no predicates that held true for 2 moments together, in short, redeemed from negation only by including indwelling realities appearing through. Well, I mean to say, what? And Nietzsche, from all accounts, a lot worse than that. Jeeves, I said when he came in with my morning tea, I've been thinking it over. You're engaged again. Thank you, sir. I sucked down a cheerful mouthful. A great respect for this bloke's judgment began to soak through me. Oh, Jeeves, I said, about that check suit. Yes, sir. Is it really a frost? A trifle too bizarre, sir, in my opinion. But lots of fellows have asked me who my tailor is. Doubtless in order to avoid him, sir. He's supposed to be one of the best men in London. I am saying nothing against his moral character, sir. I hesitated a bit. I had a feeling that I was passing into this chappie's clutches, and that if I gave in now I should become just like poor old Aubrey Fothergill, unable to call my soul my own. On the other hand, this was obviously a cove of rare intelligence, and it would be a comfort in a lot of ways to have him doing the thinking for me. I made up my mind. All right, Jeeves, I said, you know. Give the bally thing away to somebody. He looked down at me like a father gazing tenderly at the wayward child. Thank you, sir. I gave it to the under gardener last night. A little more tea, sir?
Jeeves and the Hard-Boiled Egg by P.G. Wodehouse. Sometimes of a morning, as I've sat in bed, sucking down the early cup of tea, and watched Jeeves flitting about the room and putting out the raiment for the day, I've wondered what the deuce I should do if the fellow ever took it into his head to leave me. It's not so bad when I'm in New York, but in London the anxiety is frightful. There used to be all sorts of attempts on the part of low-blighters to sneak him away from me. Young Reggie Foljambe, to my certain knowledge, offered him double what I was giving him, and Alistair Bingham-Reeves, who's got a valet who had been known to press his trousers sideways, used to look at him when he came to see me with a kind of glittering, hungry eye, which disturbed me deucedly. Bally pirates! The thing, you see, is that Jeeves is so dashed competent. You can spot it even in the way he shoves studs into a shirt. I rely on him absolutely in every crisis, and he never lets me down. And what's more, he can always be counted on to extend himself on behalf of any pal of mine who happens to be, to all appearances, knee-deep in the Boulogne. Take the rather rummy case, for instance, of dear old Bicky and his uncle, the hard-boiled egg. It happened after I had been in America for a few months. I got back to the flat latish one night, and when Jeeves bought me the final drink, he said, "Mr. Bickersteth called to see you this evening, sir, while you were out." "Oh?" I said. "Twice, sir. He appeared a trifle agitated." "What, pipped?" "He gave that impression, sir." I sipped the whisky. I was sorry if Bicky was in trouble, but as a matter of fact, I was rather glad to have something I could discuss freely with Jeeves just then, because things had been a bit strained between us for some time, and it had been rather difficult to hit on anything to talk about that wasn't apt to take a personal turn. You see, I had decided, rightly or wrongly, to grow a moustache, and this had cut Jeeves to the quick. He couldn't stick the thing at any price, and I had been living ever since in an atmosphere of bally disapproval till I was getting jolly well fed up with it. What I mean is, while there's no doubt that in certain matters of dress Jeeves's judgment is absolutely sound and should be followed, it seemed to me that it was getting a bit too thick if he was going to edit my face as well as my costume. No one can call me an unreasonable chappie, and many's the time I've given in like a lamb when Jeeves had voted against one of my pet suits or ties. But when it comes to a valet staking out a claim on your upper lip, you've simply got to have a bit of the good old bulldog pluck and defy the blighter.
He said that he would call again later, sir.
Something must be up, Jeeves.
Yes, sir.
I gave the moustache a thoughtful twirl. It seemed to hurt Jeeves a good deal, so I chucked it.
I see by the paper, sir, that Mr. Bickersteth's uncle is arriving on the Carmantic.
Yes?
His Grace the Duke of Chiswick, sir.
This was news to me, that Bicky's uncle was a duke. Rum, how little one knows about one's pals. I had met Bicky for the first time at a species of Beano or jamboree down in Washington Square, not long after my arrival in New York. I suppose I was a bit homesick at the time, and I rather took to Bicky when I found that he was an Englishman, and had in fact been up at Oxford with me. Besides, he was a frightful chump, so we naturally drifted together. And while we were taking a quiet snort in a corner that wasn't all cluttered up with artists and sculptors, he furthermore endeared himself to me by a most extraordinarily gifted imitation of a bull-terrier chasing a cat up a tree. But, though we had subsequently become extremely pally, All I knew about him was that he was generally hard up and had an uncle who relieved the strain a bit from time to time by sending him monthly remittances. "If the Duke of Chiswick is his uncle," I said, "why hasn't he a title? Why isn't he Lord Whatnot?" "Mr. Bickersteth is the son of his Grace's late sister, sir, who married Captain Rollo Bickersteth of the Coldstream Guards." Jeeves knows everything. "Is Mr. Bickersteth's father dead too?" "Yes, sir." "Leave any money?" "No, sir." I began to understand why poor old Bicky was always more or less on the rocks. To the casual and irreflective observer, it may sound a pretty good wheeze having a duke for an uncle. But the trouble about old Chiswick was that, though an extremely wealthy old buster, owning half London and about 5 counties up north, he was notoriously the most prudent spender in England. He was what Americans call a hard-boiled egg. If Bicky's people hadn't left him anything, and he depended on what he could prize out of the old duke, he was in a pretty bad way. Not that that explained why he was hunting me like this, because he was a chap who never borrowed money. He said he wanted to keep his pals, so never bit anyone's ear on principle. At this juncture the doorbell rang. Jeeves floated out to answer it. "Yes, sir, Mr. Wooster has just returned," I heard him say, and Bicky came beetling in, looking pretty sorry for himself. "Hello, Bicky," I said. "Jeeves told me you had been trying to get me. What's the trouble, Bicky?" "I'm in a hole, Bertie. I want your advice." "Say on, old lad." "My uncle's turning up tomorrow, Bertie." "So Jeeves told me." "The Duke of Chiswick, you know." "So Jeeves told me." Bicky seemed a bit surprised. "Jeeves seems to know everything." "Rather rummily. That's exactly what I was thinking just now myself." "Well, I wish," said Bicky gloomily, "that he knew a way to get me out of the hole I'm in." "Mr. Bickersteth is in a hole, Jeeves," I said, "and wants you to rally round." "Very good, sir." Bicky looked a bit doubtful. "Well, of course, you know, Bertie, this thing is by way of being a bit private and all that." "I shouldn't worry about that, old top. I bet Jeeves knows all about it already. Don't you, Jeeves?" "Yes, sir." "What?" said Bicky, rattled. "I am open to correction, sir, but is not your dilemma due to the fact that you are at a loss to explain to His Grace why you are in New York instead of in Colorado?" Bicky rocked like a jelly in a high wind. "How the deuce do you know anything about it?" "I chanced to meet His Grace's butler before we left England. He informed me that he happened to overhear His Grace speaking to you on the matter, sir, as he passed the library door." Bicky gave a hollow sort of laugh. "Well, as everybody seems to know all about it, there's no need to try to keep it dark. The old boy turfed me out, Bertie, because he said I was a brainless nincompoop. The idea was that he would give me a remittance on condition that I dashed out to some blighted locality of the name of Colorado and learned farming or ranching or whatever they call it, at some bally ranch or farm or whatever it's called. I didn't fancy the idea a bit. I should have had to ride horses and pursue cows and so forth. At the same time, don't you know, I had to have that remittance." "I get you absolutely, old thing." "Well, when I got to New York, it looked a decent sort of place to me, so I thought it would be a pretty sound notion to stop here. So I cabled to my uncle, telling him that I had dropped into a good business wheeze in the city and wanted to chuck the ranch idea. He wrote back saying that it was all right, and here I've been ever since. He thinks I'm doing well at something or other over here. I never dreamed, don't you know, that he would ever come out here. What on earth am I to do?" "Jeeves," I said, "what on earth is Mr. Bickersteth to do?" "You see," said Bicky, "I had a wireless from him to say that he was coming to stay with me, to save hotel bills, I suppose. I've always given him the impression that I was living in pretty good style. I can't have him to stay at my boarding-house." "Thought of anything, Jeeves?" I said.
"To what extent, sir, if the question is not a delicate one, are you prepared to assist Mr. Bickersteth?"
"I'll do anything I can for you, of course, Bicky, old man."
"Then, if I might make the suggestion, sir, you might lend Mr. Bickersteth—"
"No, by Jove," said Bicky firmly. "I have never touched you, Bertie, and I'm not going to start now. I may be a chump, but it's my boast that I don't owe a penny to a single soul, not counting tradesmen, of course."
"I was about to suggest, sir, that you might lend Mr. Bickersteth this flat. Mr. Bickersteth could give his Grace the impression that he was the owner of it. With your permission, I could convey the notion that I was in Mr. Bickersteth's employment, and not in yours. You would be residing here temporarily as Mr. Bickersteth's guest. His Grace would occupy the second spare bedroom. I fancy that you would find this answer satisfactorily, sir."
Bicky had stopped rocking himself and was staring at Jeeves in an awed sort of way.
"I would advocate the dispatching of a wireless message to his Grace on board the vessel, notifying him of the change of address. Mr. Bickersteth could meet his Grace at the dock and proceed directly here. Will that meet the situation, sir?"
"Absolutely."
"Thank you, sir."
Bicky followed him with his eye till the door closed. "How does he do it, Bertie?" he said. "I'll tell you what I think it is. I believe it's something to do with the shape of his head. Have you noticed his head, Bertie, old man? It sort of sticks out at the back." I hopped out of bed pretty early next morning, so as to be among those present when the old boy should arrive. I knew from experience that these ocean liners fetch up at the dock at a deucedly ungodly hour. It wasn't much after 9 by the time I'd dressed and had my morning tea, and was leaning out of the window watching the street for Bicky and his uncle. It was one of those jolly peaceful mornings that make a chappie wished he'd got a soul or something, and I was just brooding on life in general when I became aware of the dickens of a spat in progress down below. A taxi had driven up, and an old boy in a top hat had got out and was kicking up a frightful row about the fare. As far as I could make out, he was trying to get the cabby to switch from New York to London prices, and the cabby had apparently never heard of London before, and didn't seem to think a lot of it now. The old boy said that in London the trip would have set him back a shilling, and the cabby said he should worry. I called to Jeeves. "The Duke has arrived, Jeeves."
"Yes, sir."
"That'll be him at the door now." Jeeves made a long arm and opened the door, and the old boy crawled in. "How do you do, sir?" I said, bustling up and being the ray of sunshine. "Your nephew went down to the dock to meet you, but you must have missed him. My name's Wooster, don't you know, great pal of Bicky's and all that sort of thing. I'm staying with him, you know. Would you like a cup of tea? Jeeves, bring a cup of tea." Old Chiswick had sunk into an armchair and was looking about the room. "Does this luxurious flat belong to my nephew Francis?" "Absolutely." "It must be terribly expensive." "Pretty well, of course. Everything costs a lot over here, you know." He moaned. Jeeves filtered in with the tea. Old Chiswick took a stab at it to restore his tissues, and nodded. "A terrible country, Mr. Wooster, a terrible country. Nearly 8 shillings for a short cab drive. Iniquitous." He took another look around the room. It seemed to fascinate him.
"Have you any idea how much my nephew pays for this flat, Mr. Wooster?"
"About $200 a month, I believe."
"What? £40 a month?"
I began to see that unless I made the thing a bit more plausible, the scheme might turn out a frost. I could guess what the old boy was thinking. He was trying to square all this prosperity with what he knew of poor old Bicky, and one had to admit that it took a lot of squaring. For dear old Bicky, though a stout fellow and absolutely unrivalled as an imitator of bull-terriers and cats, was in many ways one of the most pronounced fatheads that ever pulled on a suit of gents' underwear. "I suppose it seems rummy to you," I said, "but the fact is, New York often bucks fellows up and makes them show a flash of speed that you wouldn't have imagined them capable of. It sort of develops them. Something in the air, don't you know? I imagine that Bicky in the past, when you knew him, may have been something of a chump, but it's quite different now. Devilish efficient sort of bird, and looked on in commercial circles as quite the nib."
"I am amazed. What is the nature of my nephew's business, Mr. Wooster?"
"Oh, just business, don't you know? The same sort of thing Rockefeller and all these coves do, you know." I slid for the door. "Awfully sorry to leave you, but I've got to meet some of the lads elsewhere." Coming out of the lift, I met Bicky bustling in from the street. "Hello, Bertie. I missed him. Has he turned up?" "He's upstairs now, having some tea." "What does he think of it all?" "He's absolutely rattled." "Ripping. I'll be toddling up then. Toodaloo, Bertie, old man. See you later." "Pip-pip, Bicky, dear boy." He trotted off full of merriment and good cheer, and I went off to the club to sit in the window and watch the traffic coming up one way and going down the other. It was latish in the evening when I looked in at the flat to dress for dinner. "Where's everybody, Jeeves?" I said, finding no little feet pattering about the place. "Gone out?"
"His Grace desired to see some of the sights of the city, sir. Mr. Bickersteth is acting as his escort. I fancy their immediate objective was Grant's tomb."
"I suppose Mr. Bickersteth is a bit bucked at the way things are going, what?"
Sir?"
"I say, I take it that Mr. Bickersteth is tolerably full of beans."
"Not altogether, sir."
Well, what's his trouble now?"
"The scheme which I took the liberty of suggesting to Mr. Bickersteth and yourself has, unfortunately, not answered entirely satisfactorily, sir."
"Well, surely the Duke believes that Mr. Bickersteth is doing well in business and all that sort of thing?"
"Exactly, sir, with the result that he has decided to cancel Mr. Bickersteth's monthly allowance, on the ground that, as Mr. Bickersteth is doing so well on his own account, he no longer requires pecuniary assistance."
"Great Scott, Jeeves, that is awful."
"Somewhat disturbing, sir."
"I never expected anything like this."
"I confess I scarcely anticipated the contingency myself, sir."
"I suppose it bowled the poor blighter over absolutely."
Mr. Bickersteth appeared somewhat taken aback, sir.
My heart bled for Bicky. "We must do something, Jeeves."
"Yes, sir."
"Can you think of anything?"
"Not at the moment, sir."
"There must be something we can do."
"It was a maxim of one of my former employers, sir, as I believe I mentioned to you once before, the present Lord Bridgeworth, that there is always a way. No doubt we shall be able to discover some solution of Mr. Bickersteth's difficulties, sir."
"Well, have a stab at it, Jeeves."
"I will spare no pains, sir."
I went and dressed sadly. It will show you pretty well how pipped I was when I tell you that I, as near as a toucher, put on a white tie with a dinner jacket. I sallied out for a bit of food, more to pass the time than because I wanted it. It seemed brutal to be wading into the bill of fare with poor old Bicky headed for the breadline. When I got back, old Chiswick had gone to bed, but Bicky was there, hunched up in an armchair, brooding tensely, with a cigarette hanging out of the corner of his mouth and a more or less glassy stare in his eyes. "This is a bit thick, old thing, what?" I said. He picked up his glass and drained it feverishly, overlooking the fact that it hadn't anything in it. "I'm done, Bertie," he said. He had another go at the glass. It didn't seem to do him any good. "If only this had happened a week ago, Bertie. My next month's money was due to roll in on Saturday. I could have worked a wheeze I've been reading about in the magazine advertisements. It seems that you can make a dashed amount of money if you can only collect a few dollars and start a chicken farm. Jolly life, too, keeping hens." He had begun to get quite worked up at the thought of it, but he slopped back in his chair at this juncture with a good deal of gloom. "But of course it's no good," he said, "because I haven't the cash. You've only to say the word, you know, Bicky, old top." "Thanks awfully, Bertie, but I'm not going to sponge on you." That's always the way in this world. The chappies you'd like to lend money to won't let you, whereas the chappies you don't want to lend it to will do everything except actually stand you on your head and lift the specky out of your pockets. As a lad who has always rolled tolerably freely in the right stuff, I've had lots of experience of the second class. Many's the time back in London I've hurried along Piccadilly and felt the hot breath of the toucher on the back of my neck and heard his sharp, excited yapping as he closed in on me. I've simply spent my life scattering largesse to blighters I didn't care a hang for. Yet here was I now, dripping doubloons and pieces of 8 and longing to hand them over, and Bicky, poor fish, absolutely on his uppers, not taking any at any price. "Well, there's only one hope, then." "What's that?" "Jeeves."
"Sir?"
There was Jeeves, standing behind me, full of zeal. In this matter of shimmering into rooms, the man is rummy to a degree. You're sitting in the old armchair, thinking of this and that, and then suddenly you look up, and there he is. He moves from point to point with as little uproar as a jellyfish. The thing startled poor old Bicky considerably. He rose from his seat like a rocketing pheasant. I'm used to Jeeves now, but often in the days when he first came to me, I've bitten my tongue freely on finding him unexpectedly in my midst.
"Did you call, sir?"
"Oh, there you are, Jeeves."
"Precisely, sir."
"Any ideas, Jeeves?"
"Why, yes, sir. Since we had our recent conversation, I fancy I have found what may prove a solution. I do not wish to appear to be taking a liberty, sir, but I think that we have overlooked his Grace's potentialities as a source of revenue."
Bicky laughed what I have sometimes seen described as a hollow, mocking laugh, a sort of bitter cackle from the back of the throat, rather than a gargle.
"I do not allude, sir," explained Jeeves, "to the possibility of inducing his Grace to part with money. I am taking the liberty of regarding his Grace in the light of an, at present, if I may say so, useless property which is capable of being developed."
Bicky looked at me in a helpless kind of way. I'm bound to say I didn't get it myself. "Couldn't you make it a bit easier, Jeeves?"
In a nutshell, sir, what I mean is this. His Grace is, in a sense, a prominent personage. The inhabitants of this country, as no doubt you are aware, sir, are peculiarly addicted to shaking hands with prominent personages. It occurred to me that Mr. Bickersteth or yourself might know of persons who would be willing to pay a small fee, let us say $2 or $3, for the privilege of an introduction, including handshake, to His Grace.
Bicky didn't seem to think much of it. Do you mean to say that anyone would be mug enough to part with solid cash just to shake hands with my uncle?
I have an aunt, sir, who paid 5 shillings to a young fellow for bringing a moving picture actor to tea at her house one Sunday. It gave her social standing among the neighbours.
Bicky wavered. If you think it could be done...
I feel convinced of it, sir.
What do you think, Bertie? I'm for it, old boy, absolutely. A very brainy wheeze.
Thank you, sir. Will there be anything further? Good night, sir.
And he flitted out, leaving us to discuss details. Until we started this business of floating old Chiswick as a money-making proposition, I had never realized what a perfectly foul time those stock exchange fellows must have when the public isn't biting freely. Nowadays I read that bit they put in the financial reports about the market opened quietly with a sympathetic eye, for, by Jove, it certainly opened quietly for us. You'd hardly believe how difficult it was to interest the public and make them take a flutter on the old boy. By the end of a week, the only name we had on our list was a delicatessen storekeeper down in Bicky's part of the town, and as he wanted us to take it out in sliced ham instead of cash, that didn't help much. There was a gleam of light when the brother of Bicky's pawnbroker offered $10 money down for an introduction to old Chiswick, but the deal fell through owing to its turning out that the chap was an anarchist and intended to kick the old boy instead of shaking hands with him. At that, it took me the deuce of a time to persuade Bicky not to grab the cash and let things take their course. He seemed to regard the pawnbroker's brother rather as a sportsman and benefactor of his species than otherwise. The whole thing, I'm inclined to think, would have been off if it hadn't been for Jeeves. There is no doubt that Jeeves is in a class of his own. In the matter of brain and resource, I don't think I have ever met a chappie so supremely like Mother Maid. He trickled into my room one morning with the good old cup of tea, and intimated that there was something doing.
Might I speak to you with regard to that matter of His Grace, sir?
It's all off. We've decided to chuck it.
Sir?
It won't work. We can't get anybody to come.
I fancy I can arrange that aspect of the matter, sir.
Do you mean to say you've managed to get anybody?
Yes, sir. 87 gentlemen from Birdsburg, sir.
I sat up in bed and spilt the tea. Birdsburg?
Birdsburg, Missouri, sir.
How did you get them?
I happened last night, sir, as you had intimated that you would be absent from home, to attend a theatrical performance, and entered into conversation between the acts with the occupant of the adjoining seat. I had observed that he was wearing a somewhat ornate decoration in his buttonhole, sir, a large blue button with the words "Boost for Birdsburg" upon it in red letters, scarcely a judicious addition to a gentleman's evening costume. To my surprise, I noticed that the auditorium was full of persons similarly decorated. I ventured to inquire the explanation, and was informed that these gentlemen, forming a party of 87, are a convention from a town of the name of Birdsburg in the state of Missouri. Their visit, I gathered, was purely of a social and pleasurable nature, and my informant spoke at some length of the entertainments arranged for their stay in the city. It was when he related with a considerable amount of satisfaction and pride that a deputation of their number had been introduced to and had shaken hands with a well-known prize fighter that it occurred to me to broach the subject of his grace. To make a long story short, sir, I have arranged, subject to your approval, that the entire convention shall be presented to his grace tomorrow afternoon.
I was amazed. 87, Jeeves. At how much a head?
I was obliged to agree to a reduction for quantity, sir. The terms finally arrived at were $150 for the party.
I thought a bit. Payable in advance?
No, sir. I endeavoured to obtain payment in advance, but was not successful.
Well, anyway, when we get it, I'll make it up to 500. Bicky'll never know. Do you suppose Mr. Bickersteth would suspect anything, Jeeves, if I made it up to 500?
I fancy not, sir. Mr. Bickersteth is an agreeable gentleman, but not bright.
All right, then. After breakfast, run down to the bank and get me some money.
Yes, sir.
You know, you're a bit of a marvel, Jeeves.
Thank you, sir.
Right-ho.
Very good, sir.
When I took dear old Bicky aside in the course of the morning and told him what had happened, he nearly broke down. He tottered into the sitting-room and buttonholed old Chiswick, who was reading the comic section of the morning paper with a kind of grim resolution. "Uncle," he said, "are you doing anything special tomorrow afternoon? I mean to say, I've asked a few of my pals in to meet you, don't you know?" The old boy cocked a speculative eye at him.
"There will be no reporters among them?"
"Reporters? Oh, rather not. Why?"
"I refuse to be badgered by reporters. There were a number of adhesive young men who endeavoured to elicit from me my views on America while the boat was approaching the dock. I will not be subjected to this persecution again."
"That'll be absolutely all right, Uncle. There won't be a newspaper man in the place."
"In that case, I shall be glad to make the acquaintance of your friends."
"You'll shake hands with them, and so forth?"
"I shall naturally order my behaviour according to the accepted rules of civilized intercourse."
Bicky thanked him heartily, and came off to lunch with me at the club, where he babbled freely of hens, incubators, and other rotten things. After mature consideration, we had decided to unleash the Birdsburg contingent on the old boy 10 at a time. Jeeves brought his theatre pal round to see us, and we arranged the whole thing with him. A very decent chappie, but rather inclined to collar the conversation and turn it in the direction of his home town's water supply system. We settled that, as an hour was about all he would be likely to stand, each gang should consider itself entitled to 7 minutes of the Duke's society by Jeeves's stopwatch, and that when their time was up, Jeeves would slide into the room and cough meaningly. Then we parted with what I believe are called mutual expressions of goodwill. The Birdsburg chappie extended a cordial invitation to us all to pop up some day and take a look at the new water supply system, for which we thanked him. Next day the deputation rolled in. The first shift consisted of the cove we had met and 9 others, almost exactly like him in every respect. They all looked deuced keen and businesslike, as if from youth they had been working in the office and catching the boss's eye and what not. They shook hands with the old boy with a good deal of apparent satisfaction, all except one chappie, who seemed to be brooding about something, and then they stood off and became chatty. "What message have you for Birdsburg, Duke?" asked our pal. The old boy seemed a bit rattled. "I have never been to Birdsburg." The chappie seemed pained. "You should pay it a visit," he said. "The most rapidly growing city in the country. Boost for Birdsburg." "Boost for Birdsburg," said the other chappies reverently. The chappie who had been brooding suddenly gave tongue. "Say!" He was a stout sort of well-fed cove, with one of those determined chins and a cold eye. The assemblage looked at him. "As a matter of business," said the chappie, "mind you, I'm not questioning anybody's good faith, but as a matter of strict business, I think this gentleman here ought to put himself on record before witnesses as stating that he really is a duke." "What do you mean, sir?" cried the old boy, getting purple. "No offence, simply business. I'm not saying anything, mind you, but there's one thing that seems kind of funny to me. This gentleman here says that his name's Mr. Bickersteth, as I understand it. Well, if you're the Duke of Chiswick, why isn't he Lord Percy something? I've read English novels, and I know all about it."
"This is monstrous."
"Oh, now don't you get hot under the collar. I'm only asking. I've a right to know. You're going to take our money, so it's only fair that we should see that we get our money's worth." The water supply cove chipped in. "You're quite right, Sims. I overlooked that when making the agreement. You see, gentlemen, as businessmen, we've a right to reasonable guarantees of good faith. We are paying Mr. Bickersteth here $150 for this reception, and we naturally want to know—" Old Chiswick gave Bicky a searching look. Then he turned to the water supply chappie. He was frightfully calm. "I can assure you that I know nothing of this," he said quite politely. "I should be grateful if you would explain." "Well, we arranged with Mr. Bickersteth that 87 citizens of Birdsburg should have the privilege of meeting and shaking hands with you for a financial consideration, mutually arranged. And what my friend Sims here means, and I'm with him here, is that we have only Mr. Bickersteth's word for it, and he is a stranger to us, that you are the Duke of Chiswick at all." Old Chiswick gulped. "Allow me to assure you, sir," he said in a rummy kind of voice, "that I am the Duke of Chiswick." "Then that's all right," said the chappie heartily. "That was all we wanted to know. Let the thing go on."
"I am sorry to say," said old Chiswick, "that it cannot go on. I am feeling a little tired. I fear I must ask to be excused."
"Oh, but there are 77 of the boys waiting round the corner at this moment, Duke, to be introduced to you."
"I fear I must disappoint them."
"But in that case the deal would have to be off."
"That is a matter for you and my nephew to discuss."
The chappie seemed troubled. "You really won't meet the rest of them?"
"No."
"Well, then, I guess we'll be going." They went out, and there was a pretty solid silence. Then old Chiswick turned to Bicky.
"Well?"
Bicky didn't seem to have anything to say.
"Was it true what the man said?"
"Yes, uncle."
"What do you mean by playing this trick?"
Bicky seemed pretty well knocked out, so I put in a word. "I think you'd better explain the whole thing, Bicky, old top." Bicky's Adam's apple jumped about a bit. Then he started. "You see, you had cut off my allowance, uncle, and I wanted a bit of money to start a chicken farm. I mean to say, it's an absolute cert if you can get a bit of capital. You buy a hen, and it lays an egg every day of the week, and you sell your eggs, say 7 for 25 cents. Keep of hen costs nothing. Profit, practically.
What is all this nonsense about hens? You led me to suppose you were a substantial businessman.
Old Bicky rather exaggerated, sir, I said, helping the chappie out. The fact is, the poor old lad is absolutely dependent on that remittance of yours, and when you cut it off, don't you know, he was pretty solidly in the soup, and had to think of some way of closing in on a bit of the ready pretty quick. That's why we thought of this handshaking scheme.
Old Chiswick foamed at the mouth. So you have lied to me. You have deliberately deceived me as to your financial status.
Poor old Bicky didn't want to go to that ranch, I explained. He doesn't like cows and horses, but he rather thinks he would be hot stuff among the hens. All he wants is a bit of capital. Don't you think it would be rather a wheeze if you were to—
After what has happened, after this deceit and foolery, not a penny.
But—
Not a penny.
There was a respectful cough in the background.
If I might make a suggestion, sir.
Jeeves was standing on the horizon, looking devilish brainy. Go ahead, Jeeves, I said.
I would merely suggest, sir, that if Mr. Bickersteth is in need of a little ready money, and is at a loss to obtain it elsewhere, he might secure the sum he requires by describing the occurrences of this afternoon for the Sunday issue of one of the more spirited and enterprising newspapers.
By Jove, I said. By George, said Bicky.
Great heavens, said old Chiswick.
Very good, sir, said Jeeves. Bicky turned to old Chiswick with a gleaming eye. Jeeves is right. I'll do it. The Chronicle would jump at it. They eat that sort of stuff. Old Chiswick gave a kind of moaning howl.
I absolutely forbid you, Francis, to do this thing.
That's all very well, said Bicky, wonderfully braced. But if I can't get the money any other way—
Wait, wait, my boy. You are so impetuous. We might arrange something.
I won't go to that bally ranch.
No, my boy. I would not suggest it. I would not for a moment suggest it. I think—
He seemed to have a bit of a struggle with himself.
I think that, on the whole, it would be best if you returned with me to England. I might— In fact, I think I see my way I might be able to utilize your services in some secretarial position.
I shouldn't mind that.
I should not be able to offer you a salary, but as you know, in English political life the unpaid secretary is a recognized figure.
The only figure I'll recognise, said Bicky firmly, is 500 quid a year, paid quarterly.
My dear boy!
Absolutely.
But your recompense, my dear Francis, would consist in the unrivalled opportunities you would have as my secretary to gain experience, to accustom yourself to the intricacies of political life, in fact, you would be in an exceedingly advantageous position.
500 a year, said Bicky, rolling it round his tongue. Why, that would be nothing to what I could make if I started a chicken farm. It stands to reason. Suppose you have a dozen hens. Each of the hens has a dozen chickens. After a bit, the chickens grow up and have a dozen chickens each themselves. And when they all start laying eggs, there's a fortune in it. You can get anything you like for eggs in America. Fellows keep them on ice for years and years, and don't sell them till they fetch about $1 a whirl. You don't think I'm going to chuck a future like this for anything under 500 goblins a year, what?" A look of anguish passed over old Chiswick's face. Then he seemed to be resigned to it.
"Very well, my boy," he said.
"What-ho?" said Bicky. "All right, then." "Jeeves," I said. Bicky had taken the old boy off to dinner to celebrate, and we were alone. "Jeeves, this has been one of your best efforts."
"Thank you, sir."
"It beats me how you do it."
"Yes, sir?"
"The only trouble is you haven't got much out of it yourself."
"I fancy Mr. Bickersteth intends, I judge from his remarks, to signify his appreciation of anything I have been fortunate enough to do to assist him at some later date when he is in a more favourable position to do so."
"It isn't enough, Jeeves."
"Sir?"
"It was a wrench, but I felt it was the only possible thing to be done. Bring my shaving things." A gleam of hope shone in the man's eye, mixed with doubt.
"You mean, sir—"
"And shave off my moustache." There was a moment's silence. I could see the fellow was deeply moved.
"Thank you very much indeed, sir,"
he said in a low voice. And that was Jeeves and the Hard-Boiled Egg, read by Nick Martin.